Hey everyone, I'm Jo Holden. I'm an active conduit for source intelligence and I'm here to help the collective. This is part two of, I've just finished uploading the part one of the magic being a target, a more detailed testimony and evidence. So now we're going to get more into the evidence side of it. The testimony was the part one. So in part two, we'll cover how can I know who's doing it and what are the effects, of that, and then a signpost to some further info. Okay, so I need to fill in some background first. I have in the Kim Poster, Kim personator, Kim scammer. Might have been a bit wound up when I put those titles together. In those, part one and part two, I did talk about having a background of having been involved with assemblies that were connected to. So when I first came across Kim's information, she was working with Tank, and it was at the time what he'd already pre-established as Speak Project. It quickly rebranded into Life Force. Life Force rebranded into UNN, its first iteration. I think we're on the third iteration now. In fact, I think in between that there was a UNC, I feel. Anyway, throughout all of that, I'd been involved not just as a passive, observer or consumer of Kim's content, but or involved in assemblies. And I've mentioned I had a friend who was involved in the Global Health and Wellness Consortium. She was the deputy director, so directly under Lisa Thomas at the time that whole thing was happening. So I'm sharing some messages. I've scrubbed out my friend's name because we've not had a conversation whereby I've checked with her that it's okay for me to share these. Hopefully, if when she sees this, she's not going to be too annoyed about it. Um, but I need to fill in background as to like all the way back in late 2021 to early 2022, some stuff that happened. So as you can see here, there's some messages exchanged between me and my friend. This was December 24th, Christmas Eve on 2021. And essentially what had happened here was my friend had sort of got set up. The outline there is supposed to be outlining the top messages. I've messed something up with the editing there. But anyway, my friend had got set up for a while throughout 2021. My friend had become increasingly concerned at some of Lisa's practices and some of her work ethics. And at the time, there were a whole lot of stuff being promised about, health assurance and life force essentials and these databases that were being put in together to code for people to have um, pre-credited cards that were supposed to be going to help them access healthcare and essential items to cover some of the costs of their living expenses, and to ensure that they could look after themselves. And there's a whole other backstory to how that came to be that I will share in another recording, but these promises had been made, and Kim on the regular was telling people in her updates, her broadcasts, that so much work was going on behind the scenes with this. And my friend bore witness to the fact that the stuff that Kim were telling people were being done wasn't being done. And not only that, Lisa seemed quite um apathetic about prioritizing any of the activities connected to the work that needed to be done for that, in terms of getting it done. In addition, my friend was speaking to Lisa for hours a day, and she sat in on some of those girls' calls that got shared after the split between Kim and Lisa and Vera. My friend had actually at the time mentioned to me that, the Intel Kim's sharing, it's a biofeedback, commercially available biofeedback machine and a seer, and we basically all just sit and Google stuff. And at the time, I I had thought, if anything, that was a show of just how powerful and important the organic intelligence was. That, these all singing, all dancing AI systems um, couldn't override what could be perceived to be the, part of the Global Intelligence Agency, which is all of us, everybody, gaining insights, downloads, guidance, all of that kind of stuff. And so I saw it as supplementary in addition to Kim's more official connections and activities, because my friend had said it was quite interesting that although they spent hours a day on these calls, any um interactions, these diplomatic lines and all of that kind of stuff, any interactions Kim had with any supposed, you know, military, politicians, intelligence agents, that kind of stuff, that never happened. The calls, the girls on the call, they'd be on there for hours at a time, but they wouldn't ever hear any of those private conversations. Kim would have to, go and take a call or go and make a call, but it wasn't something that they were ever allowed in the loop on. So I think that's pretty interesting. But in addition to Lisa's lack of prioritization and um, initiative and motivation when it came to getting, the actual work that Kim was reporting was being done in the very lengthy sessions that they'd had. Lisa had not even confided, but just quite blasé had talked about doing freezer spells, and some of those she'd targeted people in within the organization as in Life Force, in other teams. There were people who Lisa got some sort of grudge with or disagreement. She was unhappy in some sort of way. And so she joked to my friend that um, they're going in the freezer, sort of thing. So my friend initially, because of how casually it had been sort of talked about, didn't realize it was, baneful magic, essentially. Um, but then my friend had networked and created connections for herself with other people in other teams, some of them being some of the people that Lisa didn't like. So my friend had agreed with some of them they were going to get to work on getting like an official website set up. So they wanted to make sure that all the websites for PGSD, for global health and wellness, I'm trying to think what other departments would, you know, possibly they would have been working on whatever the global education consortium or whatever were going to be. And they wanted to sort of make sure that in terms of functionality and design and, they were all sort of in keeping. So my friend had started working with some people on getting that done because, again, she had said that Lisa hadn't spent more time worrying about what people were saying on the chats and, monitoring people's behaviors in that respect than any of the actual work that was supposed to be done. So not long before Christmas, my friend she having created those connections and having started done some of that work, Lisa had confronted her and asked if she'd been working behind her back, basically. And my friend said, well, I'm not seeing it as a betrayal, like I'm working behind your back. Am I working on getting a website set up? Because we've been saying for ages that this is getting done. Yeah, I've been doing that, but I'm not doing it in a malicious way. At the time, you have to think on everything that were going on globally in terms of health, in terms of, the pandemic and all of that sort of stuff. My friend, in her own right, had a lot of expertise and a lot of useful connections with practitioners from various backgrounds, some medically trained in terms of like orthodox medicine, who also had an understanding of viable solutions and or treatments that weren't what the official narrative were pushing at the time. So she'd been helping people access, help, support, prescriptions where necessary, that kind of stuff. She'd been advocating for people who had family members that were in hospital that weren't receiving the best sort of treatment. And, she's a very active person, a very conscientious person. And she got involved in the Global Health and Wellness Consortium because she had every intention of trying to help people and make a difference. Wanting to get that website set up was, for her, paramount, because people were contacting her directly asking for, kind of trying to think what she called them, not cheat sheets as such, but, breakdown of best sort of treatments and or natural alternatives for some of the more common symptoms and conditions people were suffering with. So she wanted to get that done. So Lisa confronted her, and around that time she started feeling unwell and receiving attacks. So my friend had gone to Kim, explained the whole situation. Kim had given the go-ahead in terms of getting these websites done, and had told my friend to leave it with her and she would investigate, is what she said. So these first messages is my friend saying, don't believe a word Lisa says, because by this point Lisa had started posting things on chats accusing my friend of stabbing her in the back and trying to get fired and this and the other, which is not what my friend had done, but she was being honest. So don't believe a word that Lisa says. I'm still very much a part of Life Force. At that time, she was in constant contact with Tank, Kelly, Colin, etc. So these were people from the other teams. These were people who Lisa had a grudge with and had been putting in the freezer and possibly doing other rituals as well. Now, you'd think that Kim would find it somewhat disturbing. But what happened is, so my friend says here, I believe they are setting big traps for her. She's going down soon. So my friend was under the impression at that time that Kim was doing this investigation and was basically giving Lisa enough rope to, yeah, hang herself, for the lack of a better expression. So let's fast forward a few weeks later. Initially, nothing's been said. I didn't say anything to anyone, as in I didn't post on any chats, or I didn't. There was one other person in one of the assemblies that I did confide in, but she wasn't a gossipy type of person. She didn't post anything. It stayed within us. So, um, I messaged my friend saying, "Did you listen to the Life Force update?" Because there was sort of an impromptu, now everything's sort of scheduled in a Monday, Wednesday, Friday sort of pattern when it comes to the updates. At that time, there would sometimes just a notice or a notification would come out just saying, join us live, or, and So I'd messaged my friend saying, did you listen to the Life Force update? Really off how that's been handled. Because my friend basically got thrown under the bus. By this point, she'd been kicked off all the chats, but like it all happened. There'd been nothing, no, nothing said, nothing addressed. My friend still expecting, traps to be set after speaking to Kim and explaining the situation. Um, Tumbleweed, and then this, special kind of impromptu session. As that happened, or just before that happening, my friend had been kicked off all the chats. And what was announced in that session was that, despite what people had been claiming, there might have been smoke, but there were no fire, basically. Kim just really laughed off the whole idea of anyone connected to her, certainly not Lisa. No, we don't do that stuff. We don't deal with that stuff. It's how laughable, black magic, despite the fact that, Lisa herself had told my friend that she did these things. Um, so I'm not going to read all of the messages out. Obviously, if you want to read them, you can, but the ones that I've circled are the ones that are more relevant. So, um, I explained to my friend what's been said and how everything's been sort of laughed off, and how at that point it were announced to everybody that my friend had quote unquote colluded with in terms of trying to actually get some work done. Um, they were all done, they were all gone. They were going off to set their own channel up, and Kim made it seem as if that was their choice, they'd abandoned ship. But that's not how that all went down. They were forced out and given the marching orders, basically. So as you can see, what's circled there, after it had been announced who everyone was that was jumping ship and setting their own thing up, my friend said everyone should put in the freezer. So, that's just a little bit of evidence that it was already known and Kim was aware of this. And Kim chose to maintain the friendship and the working relationship with the person who had been doing this stuff, rather than the people who had been victims of it and on the receiving end of, whatever the effects of that were. So moving on. So this is, me and my friend, our interaction continues. I'm letting her know what's been said. My friend's like, wow, that's one big fat lie. That's not how that all went down. I'm empathizing with my friend because, I'm feeling for her how unjust it is from her point of view that she's tried to do the right thing. And this is, the outcome. She's ousted, which she wasn't getting paid, just to be clear. So it's not like she'd lost her income or anything. She'd been doing this alongside working as well. So, for her, it was taking up every bit of free time that she had, and she had other things that she could do that could actually help people. So it wasn't the end of the world for her. It was just very unfair how it was all being handled. And she, on those chats, she was named and shamed, and it was made to seem as if she'd done something wrong as opposed to um the truth. So this is us just interacting, kind of me being like, what you said about, because that's actually important. My friend at this point was still giving Kim the benefit of the doubt, and so because she was, so was I. She had said it seemed to be Kim's way that she never wanted to be seen as the bad guy, and so she felt as if the spin that had been put on it was so that Kim could avoid looking like she were the one that had, um, basically wronged anybody. She wanted to be loyal to Lisa. Lisa obviously now had a huge bee in her bonnet about my friend and other team members. Um, and so rather than Kim just being like, the truth is, I have a closer working relationship with Lisa, or, whatever the true reason was, rather than say that, she instead twisted things and made it seem as if other team members had done Lisa wrong, which was not, that I'm sure she didn't like being called out, but that's not the same as them, you know, maliciously trying to harm her in the way she had maliciously tried to harm them. So I'm agreeing with my friend that it's bang out of order. I can't believe this is how it's been handled. I'm understanding what you're saying about Kim not wanting to seem like the bad guy. Now, just to be clear, I kept all of this private. I didn't post anything on any of the chats about it. I weren't trying to be, like the town crier. I felt in some respects like it wasn't my place because I was removed from it. I weren't actively involved in any of this going down. I were involved in assemblies and there were enough drama in those. I didn't want to insert myself into someone else's drama. I was just there in a friendship capacity. My friend obviously would sounding off about it as you would, as I would have, and because I'd been involved enough to understand the dynamics of that whole thing. We were talking about it regularly at that point because it's hard to talk to people who have not been involved about this kind of stuff because to them it all just sounds silly, it's like we're all adults, like what's going on? Why are you investing time and energy in this then? And unless you've got sucked into the deceptions, and this is part of the reason why I'm exposing this more occult side to it, because I honestly believe a lot of the people that are heavily invested in what Kim is saying and doing, unbeknownst to them, I do believe there are influencers through various types of practices that deliberately create, glamours, illusions, cloaking. Um, and it's not until you come out of it, it's not until something so sinister and or shocking, or something kind of snaps you out of it, like what I've been experiencing, that's enough, obviously it's enough to be like, wow, this is, I feel as if what I was seeing through these rose tinted, hopeful states, what's now being revealed is the opposite of all of that. It's really quite sickening to me when how I now see it. It's quite turns my stomach. But anyway, so my friend was highlighting that some people, so in these messages, she's talking about Tang, like couldn't even defend themselves because they'd all been kicked off the chats as well. So what were being said? It were being said to thousands of people on these chats, but the people it were being said about were given no opportunity to really address any of what they were being accused of. And there was some, like I don't know honestly the truth about whether Tank had been taking thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations, and I don't know if that's true. My friend says, according to her interactions with him, that's not true. Is he likely to be like, oh yeah, I did that? Probably not. So, I don't know the truth of that. But the underhanded handling of it obviously is relevant. Um, so we had exchanged these messages 6th and 7th of March. On the 8th of March, I messaged my friend saying, so I've been kicked off every Life Force thread. And she was like, "What? Why?" As you can see. So my initial thoughts had been that somehow, somewhere, it had been seen that maybe because I'd forwarded some messages from the group chats, but you have to bear in mind there's like thousands of people on there. I'm thinking maybe they've seen that, or maybe my friend has forwarded the messages I forwarded to her, and somehow that's gone round the grapevine, and somehow, some way, it's come back to Kim or Lisa, or so that's what I'm discussing now. I'm like, oh, I was thinking maybe you forwarded messages. I wasn't bothered in the sense of, it wasn't my friend's fault that any of this had played out. And if somehow, some way, our private communications had been picked up on, what can you do? But it was quite strange because my friend was like, no, I'm not. I have another phone. Any messages I've forwarded from you to anybody, they've been forwarded from that other phone. There's absolutely no way that anybody involved in, what was now the official Life Force, and there were this breakaway group. There's no way they should know anything about anything that you forwarded me. I've not shared it with anybody that it should be able to get back to them. So I was like, oh, don't worry about it. Just move on to the next. So I'm like, oh, don't worry about it. It's not that I was desperate to be on those chats as such. I did enjoy keeping, just a sort of overview of the what the narratives were, is in what people were kind of receiving from the updates, and what their attitudes were towards moving forward with certain types of projects and things like that. I found that interesting, but the drama side of it, the pettiness, like I rarely posted anything, and if I did, it tended to be in response to if someone were talking about a really good idea or sharing something that was some kind of solution that already existed that were useful, that kind of stuff. I'd give positive responses to things, but I didn't get drawn into the bickering, and rarely did I share anything as in from my own research, because there were enough people on those chats that came across as quite I know everything and yeah, I was more an observer in that sense. So me and my friend have continued to discuss how weird it is that Kim and or Lisa, anybody would have any awareness of me sharing these messages with my friend, and or our private messages, because that was the other thing, kind of like maybe they've took umbrage to the fact that I'm agreeing with her how out of line it all is. So my friend, as you can see, I've circled there, says to me, I think I'm being surveilled. And then she goes on to say, it's weird because Tank and Melissa, two other people that had been kicked out of the operation, um, content from their private phone calls had also been relayed somehow, some way. And she wasn't sure, how that could be the case, but the general consensus at that time was that somehow, some way, they were being listened to, they were being observed. And as you know, in that part one of the Kim Gogan expose, I'd felt it for months that I was being listened to, but I hadn't wanted to accept it and believe it because it feels too strange. It wasn't until it became crystal clear that somehow, somewhere, she's listening to everything I'm saying and doing. It's weird. And that's why I laid out, the evidence in that. So here's evidence that I'm not the only one. This has been what people have experienced in the past. This is going back to March 2022. Um, and this final message here that I've circled, my friend says, because this breakaway group that had really been kicked out had gone on to set up their own news channel, and had started doing their own, intel updates. They'd invited my friend to like present or be interviewed or, be involved. And my friend had said, yeah, I should be up for it. But nothing had been set in stone. But then it had been announced on their website or community page or whatever it was. It had been, her name had been mentioned. So this is my friend saying, so I've been mentioned. Now I'm being severely attacked last night and today. Had to cancel all kinds of stuff today. I'm doubled over in pain. Can't get out of bed. What the hell? They are all being attacked as well. Lisa is so evil. Now, obviously, at that point, Kim had kind of, despite her being the one calling the shots, being the one lying to people, Kim had been let off the hook by all of us, essentially, like given the benefit of the doubt, well, with all those caps that she wears, she's a busy person, like the fact that she hasn't vetted the director of the Global Health and Wellness Consortium, you'd think that would be a big red flag. But as I've said in previous sessions, this is the stuff I look back at now and I'm just like, how did I not see this? But it has to be said, when I do the session on there being various types of, magic and approaches to it and traditions and systems and all of that stuff, in this world at this time, the most powerful and most effective quote unquote witchery that we're all being affected by is deception, and it's word witchery. It's people convincing us of things that black is white and up is down, and you know we can't underestimate, even though that seems so simplistic, because it's like, well, yeah, but how do you stop people from lying? Like, uh, there are some more adept than others at utilizing not just their energy, but other people's energy to create illusions and facades that it's not until something comes along and really, you know, tears through it, slashes, a big old gaping hole in it, that you actually see how cleverly they have woven that web of deception around you. So, in terms of background, these are points of evidence that, I know I've not been the only one to be targeted. I now wholeheartedly believe that the reason Kim wouldn't have wanted to distance herself from Lisa Thomas is she's as bad, if not worse. She quite possibly were the one teaching Lisa these tips and tricks on how to block and stop people. I can't prove that, that's speculation. But I get the impression Kim, and she's done a very good job of downplaying in her reports, like her knowledge of magic. And as we're going to see in the next part of this, I now believe she invests a lot of her time and energy in utilizing these practices. One, to trap and attract the people that she needs, who she wants to use to, elevate herself and her profile. And two, on the sort of the public portrayal side of it. So there's the people she wants to attract in to assist her, and then there's the people who she just wants to feed off of, that keeps her shrines or altars fed, let's say. That's what I now believe her entire shtick is in terms of what she's doing. And yes, there are tangible ways that she's also taking advantage of people, but I think the energetic side of it is what has allowed her to have the level of success for as long as she has in the ways that she has. And I think if we can shift the energy around Kim's whole quote unquote operation, then I think people will start to come out of their spellbound states when it comes to her. I think they'll start to see the light themselves, the true light, not the false light that she's been presenting. So, okay. Okay, so I'm going to play this clip. This is something, Team Bubba shared this, other channels have shared this. I'm meant to do that actually. I need to find out the actual channel this came from, because I've taken this segment from what Team Bubba had shared. But this is a remote view of Kim, and I've kept it as a short segment because although there's a lot of interesting things that are said by the various people that were doing the remote view, this is the part that really stuck out to me for relevancy when it comes to Kim being involved in occult practices. Let's play this. Actually, let me just stop my audio.
Sits and holds things in her hands like objects. This is a hobby. But they represent real things to her. She's intent and focused. Sounds like card shuffling. I smell lavender. She studies these things. They have a meaning to her. She has a large book. She reads and studies, a volume with fine binding. She turns pages, religious ideas. It's a tome. She goes into philosophical teaching and holds ideas close. I see a lot of written text, but I saw this in reverse image. I couldn't tell if it was on a screen or really a written book, but complex instructions, directions, directives, has a continuity, a history, a pedigree, like a trust. Place with tables and dividers, people seated mostly in wood. It's like a hearing or courtroom. Wonder if she's ever been sued. There's a woman, she's quiet and reserved, introspective, wisdom and purpose, has had hardships, psychological hardships. She's quite determined. There's a guy with kind of curly hair, and he's being forced to present a serious, quiet facade, but he'd rather be playful, flippant, unpretentious, kind of cloak and dagger. He gives the appearance of substantial finances, but they may not be true. Large structure in the countryside. I want to know where she lives. Okay. They practice magic, incantations, spells, rituals, spooky stuff. These are people with secret lives or very personal, private lives. They work hard to keep hidden. They wear masks. Like eyes wide shut. They wear a costume and a mask. They give me a creepy feeling. Stoicism, game face is a warm smile. Reserve, she works to endure pain without showing emotion, like British stiff upper lip. Very strong-willed person. Emulating this person feels cold though. Like emotions are kept in check. This is to show professionalism in a man's world can display a warm, friendly, gay facade. So, like, not what she appears to be. I get a scene of horrible yelling and screaming and argument behind closed doors. Really nasty, nasty stuff. It is necessary to do this. She's in a situation where she has no choice. Some higher power and circumstances dictate steps that must be followed. Things have a momentum all their own. I see her older. It's a very complex lady, or maybe this is like mother or something. I don't know. Some principles didn't take in her upbringing and education. Ethics were taught but not fully accepted, didn't mesh with her being, didn't become part of her core. She does what is expedient and practical for the situation. She's trying to be a glass ceiling woman. What she promotes is designed by others. She's smart, but she's more concerned with her own wealth and advancement than others' well-being. Their well-being helps advance her aims. She's smooth and refined. She had good training.
Okay, so he does go on to say about, connected to powerful people and this kind of stuff, and everyone else in that remote view session, there were a lot of overlap and convergence. And I don't know the gentleman's name, but this guy was the one that really honed in on the more occult side of it there, which is why, that's why I've took this clip based on what we're talking about. So I want to emphasize, now that I've been learning a lot more about different types of magical practices, um, what he's describing there in terms of she holds things in her hands like a hobby. My first thought when I listened to that was, by hobby, it's like a repetitive thing. A hobby is not something we just do as a one-off. It's something we do on a regular basis. And I think that's more important, because when he says, but they represent real things to her, well, yeah, if you're using sympathetic magic, anything that you have utilized as a representative totem, or a puppet or a doll, or even if it is just another object of some kind, there are practices that can be used where you're essentially attaching the soul signature of whoever your target is to that particular item. So whenever you are then manipulating it in any kind of way, or focusing on it and projecting certain states or experiences for that person, you're going to utilize that. It's necessary. He says she's intent and focus. Sounds like card shuffling. Again, yeah. Although I'm certainly not going to sit here and demean divination in terms of, I'd be a hypocrite to say it's a bad thing to practice tarot and stuff, because I've already mentioned in part one, I've had a lot of help and assistance through various types of tarot. I do have some cards myself. I'm not practiced enough to, I won't be able to do someone else a reading or anything. I bought them years ago out of curiosity more than anything, because I've studied lots of different types of, energy healing and meditation and this type of stuff. It was more a curiosity for me. However, what I do now know is there is a heavy reliance. Many different approaches to magic rely upon the integration. It's an interdisciplinary approach that is needed to stay kind of on top of your game, if you like, in terms of ensuring that the desired effects are being created, and what's going on with the target. And divination is a part of that. It is, of course, helpful if you can also surveil the person because then you can tell based on what their activities are, their actions, what they're communicating to people, whether they're coming out of certain states or, if they appear to be healing, if they appear to be um their energy levels are, recharging kind of thing. So I think that's a very significant part of it. Um, she studies these things, they have meaning to her. Yeah, they will have a lot of meaning if she's using them intently in terms of it's not just a curiosity, it's not just a way to pass the time. It's, she's doing that divination for a purpose. She's looking for answers, she's looking for guidance, which if you're reading on anybody without their consent and or without their request, you're already in the baneful side of things because it's intrusive, in the same way that in the physical, if you're listening into people's phone calls and or what they're watching or listening on, whatever device, if you're doing that in the same way that that's illegal, unlawful, unethical, energetically speaking, if you're doing it, in a spiritual sense, then you've got the same issue that's happening. It's still unethical, immoral, and frowned upon under spiritual law or natural law. So she studies these things, they have meaning to her. Now, what I've highlighted in green here, we're going to go off on a little tangent with this because I think this is very significant. She has a large book she reads and studies religious ideas. It's a term. She goes into philosophical teachings, and I've put in brackets there, theosophy, question mark. This is relevant, in the next slides, we'll look at that. She keeps ideas close. Yeah, because she's done a very good job, as I've just mentioned, of acting as if like all of this stuff, it's what the deep state do. It's nothing, she would never be involved in any of this kind of stuff. I think Kim has the capability to be very strategic, very cunning, very calculated, and knowledge, information, wisdom, if you've got it, is power, right? So I think I almost feel as though, when people talk about narcissistic traits, and one of them is that there's a sense of superiority if they can get away with fooling you, and if they what to most people it wouldn't even be worth lying about. It's stuff that, it's like, well, what do you gain from that? I think for those types of personalities, the thrill itself is knowing that they've deceived you and you've fallen for it. You're the fool, they're the genius, sort of thing. And I think there's some of that, in addition to the fact that I would imagine a big part of the effectiveness of these practices is comes from the secrecy of it, So I think that's relevant. Reverse text, complex instructions, directions. Well, having now done more research, if you start looking at grimoires and the various steps and the just how detailed a lot of again, it depends what type of magic it is, but some of the stuff is like, wow, that's a lot of work and it's a lot of preparation, and you'd really have to know what you were doing to ensure that you followed it effectively and appropriately, and safely if you're working with demons or lower density beings or whatever. um you need to know that you're doing it right. And then it goes on to say, there's a history, continuity, a pedigree. Well, you find that when you start looking into the various societies and stuff, that the hierarchy of it's not just your bloodlines as most people now know it in terms of, their control systems as such, but within these various societies, it's not just how many different levels and layers of initiation or mastery you yourself have gone through, but if you also come from, a background where you've got connections with people that have proven to be like high performing magicians and whatnot, like there's, it's a little bit like in society, it's like, do you know who my dad is? So it's that. If you are connected to people that have performed extraordinary feats, let's say, there's some shine that rubs off on you. People are like, oh wow, you're connected to that person, you know that person, you're related to that person. And it's, it seems to me, based on listening to testimonies from people and some of the articles I've read and books I've read, it seems as if that's especially true in these circles, because you have to remember the whole mentality about this is, the enlightened ones, the illuminated ones, the we know things no one else knows. It's all of that. So if you are at a level of adeptness or performance that ranks high within, what is perceived to be the most elite or special group anyway, like, it's a big deal. So they practice magic, incantations, spells, rituals, spooky stuff. Sounds like, what you were picking up on what is attending, rituals and ceremonies and whatnot. Can display a warm, friendly gift. Sad. Well, we know that. That's she does that 3 times a week. Um, but not what she appears to be. And obviously went on to say um more about that in terms of what her true priorities are and where her actual integrity is, which is service to self. Um, Now, obviously, people could say, well, yeah, but Jodie, this is a remote view, and there's nothing to say that any of this is true. That's true. But in the part two, I believe it was, of the Kim Gogan sessions that I did, she was quite happy to let people know how highly skilled and highly trained she was, and remote viewing were very much a part of her practice in terms of, fighting off adversaries and enemies and keeping ahead of the game in terms of her operations. So, we need to have, and we need to bear in mind that it's no secret these days that intelligence agencies have invested huge amounts of money in quote unquote psionic research, the use of remote viewing, the use of um, sort of psychic warfare, the use of um, the ability to astral travel. And I shared in one of the videos the screenshot of like the gateway process and the gateway project, and it's not been a small side budget. A lot of money's been invested in that, and a lot of people have been put through these programs, and of course it does all tie into like your MK Ultra and whatnot as well. But I think you're looking at two different sides of the coin there in terms of MK Ultra being the result of things that were learned from the psionic research that they did, and then figuring out how they can utilize it to essentially turn people into weapons and slaves. And so I think MK Ultra was then a byproduct of some of the things that they figured out we as human beings could do. So it's not as if remote viewing, it's like, oh yeah, but we know, these are all charlatans. There were a lot of what was said in this session that to me it consolidated and brought together. It made a lot of sense of a lot of things that I've really been trying to figure out as to like what to believe and what not to believe, what my intuition was saying, what some of the questions when I've been comparing and contrasting the various contradictions and conflicting aspects of Kim's, you know, her older reports and then her more up to date reports. The conflict between them. It's like, so what is true essentially? And the things that were said in this I found really useful in terms of reconciling some of that. So let's go off on this little tangent about the large book that she reads, religious ideas, philosophical teachings, and let me just highlight why I'm question marking the theosophy side of it. So for anybody that's not familiar with theosophy, one of the central figures in what has now become, an area of study and a school of thought. There's like there are societies now, theosophical societies and whatnot, and a lot of it is really about pursuing higher truths or being more enlightened on things. So I'm not suggesting that the whole study of theosophy is wrong or bad, but it definitely ties in with the occult. So Helena Blavatsky is very well known for her being a key figure in what was the creation essentially of theosophy, but then utilizing what was seen as, like your spiritual sciences and whatnot, utilizing them for like a renaissance of magic, where, they kind of historically speaking split it into what was around in the more medieval times and even prior to that. And then, of course, we went through this period where there were witch hunts and, they were stamping it out. And so there were a period of time where only those behind the scenes would have had access to it and use of it in terms of access to learning materials and, the space and the support to actually learn to utilize it. That was all, let's say, underground. And then the populace at large were too afraid because there'd been serious consequences for people caught practicing different things. So when the dust had settled, let's say a couple of 100 years after the witch hunts and everything, Madame Blavatsky starts to stoke a reignition of what had been hidden knowledge. And so, as you can see there, she was a Russian noblewoman, a world traveler, a prolific writer, and a controversial spiritualist. She claimed to have access to ancient wisdom. And then, as you can see here, is some examples of her being involved in all things esoteric and the secrets of hidden wisdom, which you can see there. One of the titles of one of the texts that she wrote, The Science of Magic. And so she was Russian by descent, but I believe migrated to America. I'm not sure if that happened when she was younger. It will say here, I would have thought. If I can move this out the way. Okay, so it looks like as an adult, she traveled around and then she based herself in America. So as you can see here, quick search on Google brings up her Wikipedia page. Blavatsky's writings garnered the materials of Neoplatonism, Renaissance magic, Kabbalah, and Freemasonry. together with ancient Egyptian and Greco-Roman mythology and religion. So a lot of stuff, she knew a lot about a lot of different things. So one of the things that she is known for is being a founding figure in what was originally the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Now, there has been a resurgence of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It's now more recently depicted as something much more member friendly, like you can join if you want to, but what it used to be, going back to these earlier, like the 19th and 20th centuries, what it was much more secretive. It was one of your major secret societies that taught magic, and it's been associated with where like your various bloodline families would have had their teachings provided. Aleister Crowley were also an early member of the order. As you can see, when it comes to teachings around the Order of the Golden Dawn, it's quite interesting. The Golden Age thing. I do understand that the concept of a golden age goes all the way back to Greek mythology and all of that kind of stuff. But I do find it very interesting that Kim has this whole golden age and golden age AI, and the Order of the Golden Dawn first came onto my radar on the playlist that I've put together that I'm going to signpost people to. There's a guy called John Todd. In fact, we'll come to him on the next slide, I think. He was like one of your earlier whistleblowers, come insiders. In the 70s, he was speaking out against, he came from a bloodline family who he'd been raised in the Order of the Golden Dawn, but like the real deal stuff, not the face front, like, no, come along, learn some interesting new agey stuff. Not that side of it, the hardcore secret societies where anybody that were anybody that had any kind of sway in the control of the planet were all somehow, some way sort of connected in. And he had talked about it. And at the time that I came across his material, what I found interesting was I'd never even heard of this Order of the Golden Dawn. I've heard of Order of the Black Sun, obviously, Order of the Dragon, obviously. I've heard of other secret societies, but it seemed strange to me that the way he was talking about it were as if, it's that very high up in the hierarchy of who's, which covens essentially are controlling various organizations and institutions. It was a very high level society, but yet it seemed strange to me that I'd never heard of it before. So I did a bit of research, and then that's when it clicked that it tied into theosophy, and I'd already learned a bit about Helena Blavatsky, and so it these seemed like relevant dots to me in terms of connecting, where I always feel like the stuff that doesn't get talked about very often is the stuff we should be looking more at, because there's a whole lot of truth material out there, and the alternative media, it's ablaze all the time with and they've done this and they've done that and they're coming for you next in this way, and it's a lot of noise, but a lot of it is repetitive, and a lot of it, when you really start to make sense of what's actually keeping the planet suppressed and oppressed, it really is just another dog and pony show. It really is just the same thing that all of the alternative media people will tell you the mainstream media is doing. that's exactly what's happening in the alternative media as well. It's just another flavor, you know. Um, so whenever I've come across things that it's like, this is interesting, this is not what many people are talking about, but yeah, it seems to have a real significance. That's the stuff naturally I want to know more about. So, the Order of the Golden Dawn, what I've circled here, from enigmatic individuals like Aleister Crowley and Helena Blavatsky to influential groups like the Order of the Golden Dawn, these trailblazers have left an enduring legacy on spiritual exploration and the occult tradition. So, the point there being these are key figures, and these are things that they were heavily involved in, either the inception of, the creation of, and or in Aleister Crowley's case, he did end up getting himself kicked out of the Order of the Golden Dawn according to the history of it, but not before taking a lot of their rights, and yeah, and when I say rights, I mean it as in rights, as in their methods and approaches to things, their various kind of ceremonial, magical blueprints, if you like. Once he'd gathered a fair bit of their content, he then went on to create Thelema, I think it's pronounced Thelema something. So connection to the Golden Age thing I found interesting, connection to what that remote viewer was saying about, her studying these texts intently, and there is, when you look at the various types of magic, there is absolutely a convergence. A lot of the traditions, a lot of the types, not as in the methods, but as in the systems, are a convergence of religion with then, various approaches to magic. So, for instance, Santeria as a system is a combination of Catholicism and then I believe it's voodoo, African voodoo. Then combined, that gives you Santeria sort of thing. So there is a lot of convergence between these different systems and disciplines. So just some information about Alice Crowley in terms of, it's well known, it's well documented that he was also involved in the Order of the Golden Dawn. So this is where I mentioned the guy John Todd. So he came from bloodline families. He was speaking out at a time where, he didn't have the same, let's say, safety in numbers that a lot of people, rely upon these days to speak out about things. He was absolutely targeted. Although I've circled here, it says he was convicted for charges of rape and sentenced to a long stint in prison, and then went on to be placed in a psychiatric facility. I don't know the true story around that in terms of whether that was some sort of setup. I know he'd been targeted. He speaks in some of his presentations about there being attempts on his life. I don't know if this were just another way to kind of shut him up and put him away, or if he, if in fact he had committed the offence, and if he had, then obviously um I'm not here to be a character witness or I'm highlighting him because he was speaking out about a lot of stuff that the more research I've done, his testimonies and claims that he made, and this because of how long ago it was and what was available at the time in terms of recording equipment and stuff, a lot of his presentations were done in sort of like church congregations and stuff. The quality is not the best in terms of sound, so they can be a bit rough to kind of listen through. But a lot of the stuff that he was talking about appears to me to be far more accurate. And I mentioned in one of the sessions that I did about Shane Sador being Illuminati bloodline sort of offspring and having spoken out and done the Ruiner blog and stuff. It seems to me that what John Todd was sharing as a younger man before getting locked up, there seems to be more truth to it than a lot of the stuff that we now see being bandied around as which I think is more to confuse people. So um when I searched for John Todd Order of the Golden Dawn, because that was the society his family had like raised him in, they went back several generations. Within that sort of, hierarchy, what it brought up was the Alpha and Omega was an occult order initially named the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So it had rebranded and become Alpha and Omega, which I found that interesting in relation to Kim, in terms of, her whole shtick to start with was that she was working with this Alpha system, and I know that there's trusts that are related to that kind of stuff as well, but it seems interesting to me. It, it's like she's been telling people all along really what she's connected to, but without telling people all along what she's connected to, if that makes sense. So that's my interpretation of it anyway. So in the segment where the remote viewer had talked about things, the reverse text thing, another thing it made me think about was your ancient languages when it comes to the scriptures, whether it be biblical or, from other traditions as well. I know there's a list of 12 that I've just let me move this back out of the way. There's a list of 12 that are, your more ancient languages that were written from right to left instead of left to right. And so the remote viewer mentioning about the reverse text thing, and he weren't sure whether what he was seeing, it was just because it were on a screen or something. When you're looking at very old sort of grimoires and stuff, in the same way that like the earliest biblical, I don't know why I can't talk tonight. Well, I do actually. I mentioned to you in part one. I do keep getting this feeling as if something's like hitting my throat. So, please bear with me. Um, when you look at like the earliest versions of like the Bible as an example, many of them, it's Arabic and Hebrew, and I know like ancient Greek as well, which is not a reverse language, but I would suspect if you were privy to, if you were able to get access to some of the oldest, most elite, I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking for, exclusive sort of magical texts. I would imagine there's a similar thing with them that I'm sure there are more modern translations, but if you want to go back to the actual original sources, I would guess that you'd be looking, with some of them at least, at these ancient languages. So that kind of stuck in my mind. Let me just move on to the next page. What it also made me think about was, as we all know, Anton LaVey was a very well-known Satanist, but also involved in magical practices and the music industry. So a lot of LaVeyan practices, and he was very well known for like his sigils and all that kind of stuff. The devil's rights, as it says here. Um, so there were a lot of reversal and inversion with what was utilized as ways to invoke, the devil's spirit and all of that kind of stuff. But it reminded me as well, I'd heard about Mark Devlin talks about this, which is why I've included him there and circled it. There was a practice that people somehow, some way had picked up on that certain songs, they call it backmasking, where there'd be like hidden messages within the music that if you played the song backwards, um, there would be like satanic spells or, invocations and things like that. Years ago, I remember hearing Mark Devlin talk about this and just at the time being like, I mean, that's kind of fascinating, but I weren't sure if it were real and true. And of course, if you just do a general search, it does kind of get ridiculed a little bit, like, oh, this is what people believed during the satanic panic, back in the 1980s. Um, but when you listen to someone who's actually done the research, Mark Devlin really does seem to know what he's talking about. And he, I know in some of his interviews and podcasts, and he's traveled around the world doing speaking events and stuff. And I know he's given examples, as in he's played certain songs and had them play backwards. And supposedly it is a method that they use. So it made me think of that as well, more from like if you're talking about someone reading magical texts or grimoires or, ancient sort of scriptures, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're of a negative variety, but I'm just establishing here that, the reversals and stuff, it can also be a key um, identifying factor when it comes to like the inverted, the black magic side of it. All right, so that was the whole tangent I wanted to take people off on in terms of the notes that I made from that clip. So here's another clip now, which I feel adds to the evidence of why I believe my attacks that I've been receiving. I don't think they're coming only from Kim Gogan, just to be clear. It feels to me that there's a group involved. But why I believe 100% she's involved, yeah, this is all evidence.
Is the Man-O-War Trust. We haven't talked about that in a while, so why don't you?
Well, we have never really talked about it, but it gets brought up. People ask, are you involved with that? And the answer, quite simply, is no. We've attempted to be aligned in the past with that, but it wasn't something that we felt, was the kind of integrity that we want to represent.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there's the individual that is running that is just kind of a volatile person and really difficult to work with, and she doesn't like to play well with others, and so that's an issue with it as well, because what happens, and I know a lot of people are talking about money moving out from that trust, and we've had difficulties in the past, and this is what we've struggled with, is finding a secure way to move funds, and so it's taken a very rather large collaboration and a lot of moving parts in order to do it, because every time we move money, we risk getting it taken by the opposition and actually it's funding our opposition. So it's a very delicate situation to do. And if you're not willing to work with others and make it happen, then you're not really going to find success. And there are some other tactics that she employs that we're just not comfortable with. As far as working, it's something we're not morally comfortable with.
And of course, in order.
So even though it's not a direct admission that, Kim is using black magic, I think they're tiptoeing around it in terms of, just not morally comfortable. To bear in mind, these are people who are running their own grift, Like, I say that, I mean, I've recently gone on to have a look at what it is that they've been, putting out there, because this whole series, and I did in fact come across the Deep Disclosure series before I ever even knew Kim Gogan existed. So there's kind of been some backstory filled in when I realized that Megan had been involved in the UPU with Kim. At some point, I'll do a session where I'll share a little bit more about when I first came across Deep Disclosure, which was all the way back in 2017. So in terms of timeline, Megan had been involved in the UPU thing. It's very strange based on how that were put across in, the THI podcast that they did. It's very interesting that to hear Megan talk at the time, she, Ava, and Kim, they were all part of the team with the UPU. So it's kind of funny to me that, she got kicked out and then Ava later got kicked out, and yet Kim's been the one calling the shots on that. How do the UPU feel about that? They made it seem like they'd all been given these very special positions, and they were all highly honoured to be working with the UPU. So it's kind of interesting that just fell by the wayside for Megan and for Ava. But I will do a session where I'll explain when this Deep Disclosure series was running. Megan and Mr. M, the partner that she has, they'd set up a website which is still up. This is what I went to have a look at the other day just to see if it was still up. It's White Hat Intel, and that website they've now got, that's still there, but they've got offshoots, other websites connected to all different things. They're setting up a whole global payment system, and they're selling crypto tokens and doing all sorts of stuff. They've got this Gaia thing that is, I think, supposed to be to do with technologies, and I'd have to go back and double check. So I had a look around on the different sites, but at the time when they set up the White Hat Intel, I actually registered a project proposal that I had for some of the content that I want to share. And not long after that, two things happened. So at the same time that I'd done that, I also had some email exchange with Laura Eisenhower. At the time, she was doing the circuits in the whole cosmic disclosure sort of groups. But she'd been offering her, services as a intuitive and a reader and stuff. And at the time, I was feeling very much like I was trying to figure out everything that were going on for me. So there'd been an exchange between her and I. So I'd been following the Deep Disclosure thing. I'd reached out to Laura Eisenhower. I'd registered this project, and within weeks of me doing that, my computer got hacked. I'm saying hacked. Something happened so that every file that I had, and I'd spent years gathering information at that point, still trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing with it and how to present it to people. I'd spent months pulling it together, and I'd got pretty detailed outlines of several chapters for a book. I'd got like presentations similar to this sort of style put together for some training I wanted to deliver. I really just wanted some help, some guidance on how I'm no good when it comes to digital marketing, or I'm not very good at selling myself, and all of that. It just feels a bit I don't want to self promotion, and so that's what I wanted some help, some guidance with. So I'd registered this project, and anything and everything that had get set in the, title and or maybe even in the body of it. I got up one day, having been working on several of these files on a regular basis, and there were files just completely gone that I couldn't, I couldn't believe it. I felt like this has to be a mistake. This has to be a mistake. I know these files were here. I know where I saved them. I know what they were titled. I'm like looking, gone. And the ones that were still there, and that were mainly like the PowerPoint presentation type ones, every time I tried to open them, my entire computer just shut down. So I ended up just deleting them after restarting my computer several times. I just deleted them and then had, a few days of just feeling shocked, gutted, devastated, feeling like I'd wasted hundreds, if not thousands of hours of my time. That in terms of pulling it together, hundreds of hours. But in terms of all the background work that had been done to initially, I'd got like long reference lists so that I could remember everything, where I'd heard different things, and all of that kind of stuff, because I'd saved them all under the Get Set sort of title. So I wasn't sure at the time whether that had happened because I'd submitted the project proposal to the database that they had connected to their website at the time, or whether that had happened because I'd had the interactions with Laura Eisenhower. So when I found out that Megan had been interconnected with whatever it is that Kim's got going on, and knowing that Megan, I did actually end up going on to have a call with Megan. I think it would have been around 2019, because I was trying to gather as much information as possible, and I kept wanting to actually speak to people in like a instead of just listening to them do an interview, or instead of just reading, literature that they've put together, or reading the website or whatever. You just want that real person interaction. It's kind of like, give me the download. Like, what's actually the deal here? Like, you just want to get a real feel for people. And so wherever it was viable, if I could afford it, and or the opportunity was there to connect with people, then I would attempt to do that. So Megan was someone else that, after what had happened with the files that I've just told you about, I ended up having a conversation with her, and I'm not going to go into that whole story now, but as all of these events have been unfolding, it's making more sense of certain things from then, and from that call specifically, which I'll share in another session. But so, remembering that Megan was a team member in terms of the UPU with Kim, and she and her partner, maybe I shouldn't call it a grift. Maybe there really is something in the background, that there is some kind of, new financial system that is being created, that is going to be for the benefit of the people, and maybe there's just different people out there trying to be the face of it. I find it interesting with Kim's narrative that if you look at what they were sharing with people, and then if you were to combine that with Shane Sador's information, and then also possibly, Neil Keenan is one of the people that Team Bubba had sort of highlighted as like an associate. But I think actually, looking at the timeline of things, Neil Keenan's information predated anything that Kim put out publicly. Whatever she was telling people behind the scenes is, a different story. But in terms of her becoming like a online presence, Neil Keenan had been claiming to be, having power of attorney for Dragon family money releases and all that kind of stuff well before Kim. But the relationship would be that Neil Keenan was regularly being interviewed on Cosmic Voice, and that's where Kim initially, as a member, had started to gather and garner information from people and, created a relationship with Thomas Williams. And so if you were to combine what Megan and Mr. M, I think his name's Matthew Mateus, something like that, what they're talking about, if you combine that with Neil Keenan's information and Shane Sedor's Ruiner blog info, put that all together and you've basically got Kim's whole story. So, if you're looking for ideas of where she might have gathered inspiration for all these different things, if you familiarize yourself with the deep disclosure sessions, which were in 2017, and Shane's Ruiner blog that was 2015, and Neil Keenan stuff that I believe started around 2011, I want to say. No later than 2014, but I feel like it went back as early as 2011. Take key elements of all of those. What came, I know she did the UPU in 2016. I know she did the Kingdom of Mana thing in 2017, 2018. But when she joined forces with Tank, there was a whole rebrand thing that went on and Kim's story changed. And I don't know whether she worked with Tank to do that or whether she'd come up with it herself and then presented it to Tank, and that's why the merge happened with, she jumped ship from Cosmic Voice over to Speak Project, but not Cosmic Voice, THI. In that leap, that quantum leap that she made over there, that's where all of these bits and pieces of information sort of came together to become Kim's new backstory, essentially. So, in terms of how do I know who's attacking me, having someone who worked directly with her talk about how some of her practices are immoral, and yes, she doesn't say specifically what it is, but I believe, this is what she's referring to, because we're talking to people, or we're talking about people here who have no qualms whatsoever about making money off telling people half truths or full lies about quantum systems and, being trustees. They claim to be trustees as well, and all of that. Okay, so how else can I know who's doing it? These are anecdotal, speculative, it's subjective because it's based on my experience, but the timings in relation to the surveillance side of it, why else would the attacks become so intense whenever I try to get on path or speak out about things? That's, as I've put there, why I believe the surveillance aspect of it is so important, because I think it's not just, or it's not even about stealing content, and I think that's possibly just been a bit of a bonus for Kim. But I think the true purpose of it is to check, to ensure, to maintain insight as to whether the different practices that they've done, that they've been using, whether they're working, whether they're lasting, whether they need redoing. That I honestly believe, based on attacks I've been receiving, it has to be coming from them, because there's only Kim, as far as I'm aware, who has shown any proof whatsoever that she's somehow, some way been listening to me. I don't know of anybody else. I'm not saying there aren't other people connected to her that haven't, watched and seen and heard things that I've been doing. but she's the only one I've seen evidence of. She knows exactly what in private I've been recording. She knows exactly what in private I've been listening to. She knows exactly what in private I've had conversations with people about. I've seen proof of it over and over and over again. And therefore, there's got to be a reason she's doing that. And it always coincides with if what is being observed with me does not fit the required circumstance at their end, I then start getting more and more attacks. So I think that's significant. Energy transfer, that's a side effect, but part of what these practices are designed to do is when they're, weakening you and taking, siphoning your energy and doing all that kind of stuff. The exchange is when they're then projecting baneful dark energy at you with dark intention, and there's a transfer that's happening. And so if you do that enough, often enough, for long enough, that other person's going to really start to have, like a, let's say, flavor of you. They're going to know, like, honestly, Kim's energy now makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I have quite literally heard Kim's voice. On a few occasions, I've heard it, but in a very echoey kind of way. When some of these attacks have been happening, I've heard her voice. But there was one specific occasion where I heard it as clear as if she was stood next to me speaking into my ear. And that was an astral attack. And as I woke up, so, what I described in part one with those severe attacks that I received with the sort of, what I believe were death magic attacks. This was one of those astral attacks where it became a lucid dream. I became consciously aware in the dream, and I woke up at, or when I say woke up, I became consciously aware exactly at the point where two people had, so I was being dragged, and someone had got me under one arm, someone else got me under the other arm, and someone was behind me pulling me. And I believe the character who was pulling me from behind had to have been Kim because of what I heard and like the positioning of it. So I was being dragged towards a fire, and I woke up from the dream as my body had been thrown. It was sort of, you know, flying into this fire. I was being thrown in a fire. And what I heard very clearly in Kim's voice in my ear was, and again, please excuse the graphicness and the nastiness of it and the profanity, but I'm going to say it exactly how I heard it. So I heard, "You fucking witch bitch," in her voice, as if she were like speaking in my ear, which suggests to me, on some level, she must think I am the witch. She must think I practice magic, which is not the case. It's a little bit like, this is how it feels to me. It feels as though, imagine someone attacks you and they do taekwondo, and you manage to sort of block and stop and break free from their attack. It's like them then turning around and going, "Well, you must be a taekwondo practicer too." It's like, no, I've never trained in taekwondo. I don't do taekwondo. I was just stopping you from attacking me, and it was interesting because I'm laughing about it now, but as I woke up, you can imagine feeling like you're genuinely being thrown in a fire. And I don't mean that as in I actually felt the heat on my back, and it all happened very quickly. These are the things where my higher self or higher guidance, something is looking out for me, because I always seem to get woken up just at the moment when things are like really gonna kick off. Um, to be aware of it. And now I know when these things happen, how to kind of clear, cancel, delete, refuse any agreement to anything that any effect that they're trying to create, make it known, make sure, I've opened cases with spiritual courts and, it's been a whole thing. So although I can't prove that happened, I know it happened. And I know what I heard, and I know whose voice it was, and I know whose energy I've got very used to now. So, how else do I know? This is part of it. Whenever I've done cord cuttings, return to senders, when I've been doing it in a much more, in a deep ritual sense, a deep meditative sort of way, it's Kim and a group of people who I don't know these other people, but it's her with others that I can always see in my mind's eye and her energy that I can feel the presence of. I don't know the other energies. I can just feel that there are other energies. And then this, to some people, probably going to sound silly, but it's significant to me. My dog, who is beautiful and such a kind soul and super calm and lovely, and she's the best. Whenever I've gone back to listen to different things, as I've been putting these materials together, and even prior, there was things in my own research I'd wanted to I was trying to make sense of that whole, how did I fall for that whole facade? And there were things that I wanted to check whether, did I even hear this right? Or have I just drawn erroneous conclusions? Did she actually say this as opposed to that? And so I've gone back, I've listened to stuff. As I've been doing that, since the attacks have been, they've been increasingly sort of frequent and intense. And my dog, when it's really bad, like she's feeling it, she's sensing it, energetically. And she hardly ever whinges and whines, but she does when this is happening. And so, of course, I try to comfort her and make her feel as safe and secure as possible. I don't know the effects it's having for her. I've described my physical symptoms. I don't know what her physical symptoms are, because we can only communicate to a certain extent given she's a dog. But even now when I've played, sort of been listening back to things connected to Kim, she's had the same reaction as when we've had some of the attacks. And I say we because I genuinely believe, she's been affected too. In fact, in some respects, so have my children. And, I think I mentioned in part one about my daughter having that lucid dream about being chased and the roof and the tile and all of that. There's been a number of things that it's coincided when the attacks have been really bad. My children also suffering certain consequences, I would say, which, that as a mum, you can imagine how, the mix of emotions that I feel, the upset that I feel, the guilt that I feel, the last thing you ever want for your children is for you somehow, some way, indirectly being the cause of them potentially being attacked in any kind of way. So that, is not cool. And, I hope those who do this to other people somehow, some way, at some point, experience everything that they've inflicted on other people. I hope they experience it themselves because they deserve to, and hopefully they'll learn a lesson from it. But it's not my call because I am not the whole God. I am only a small representation here to try and do some good. So not for me to decide what needs to happen. So, as I've just mentioned, effects, it's not just me, my children appear to have been targeted at times too. After extreme attacks, in the past, it's taken sometimes days, sometimes weeks. In certain cases, like the more extreme attacks I talked about in part one, it's there's been months sometimes to fully like rebalance, recalibrate, and heal from it. Um, Day to day can vary. It depends whether the vampirically sucking energy from me or whether they're trying to project energy onto me. Again, I have got better at knowing how to block and stop and, send stuff back and all of that. So it's just frustrating having to be so caught up in doing that. I just want to be able to live my life. I miss the carefreeness with which I just used to go about my daily activities, and you don't know what you've got till it's gone, sort of thing. It's like I had no idea how peaceful my life used to feel until all of this. Um, I now have to have, well, I don't have to have daily practices, but I certainly don't want to end up feeling like I'm in an energetic prison again. So for my own safety and sanity, I do have to have daily practices to defend and protect myself. There's things that I do every morning when I wake up, as soon as I wake up, stuff every night before I go to sleep, and if I'm woken up during the night, which happens regularly, stuff I need to do to make sure I nullify and neutralize any of the crap that they're trying to do. Um, and there's stuff throughout the day. It depends again what sensations I'm feeling. I'm responding to it as opposed to, instigating it. So it depends what is being attempted. Moon cycles have become significant, not to the extent that, I can tell you everything about that particular moon phase or whatever, but I keep mindful now of when things are amplifying and when things are, kind of waning or I mentioned in part one, there's a correlation in terms of like the intensity of effects for me. And that also does apply to like the external effects as well in terms of how likely, I've never been that kind of person who's like, before I decide whether to make this journey or not, let me just check my moon phase. I've never been that person, but I do pay attention to some of that stuff now. Relationships have changed. I talked about this in part one, but I do believe in everything for a reason. I do think the aims on the side of those people who have wanted me to feel isolated and whatnot. Obviously, that was for me to just want to give in and get back to normal and, live a easier, happier life by not pursuing what I've been working on all these years. I I do believe from higher self, higher guidance, support systems point of view, although it's not been pleasant for me, I think from there's been method in the madness of allowing certain things to happen so I can have that time of isolation, so I can figure a lot of this stuff out. I think it's been a deliberate part of my, growth and development. As much as I've not enjoyed it, at the same time, I can see, the wisdom in that. So, two sides of the same coin, but it has affected relationships, and I have wanted to just be alone a lot of the time because when you're dealing with a lot of the stuff I've mentioned energetically, it can be difficult. You're trying to interact with people if you're in a group situation, a social event or something. Trying to do that while you feel like, something's trying to sort of like stab you in the heart or suck energy out of your stomach or whatever. It's not pleasant at all. So it can feel easier to just have your own space and be alone. And there's been a fair bit of undue expense. You know, I mentioned in part one about stuff breaking a lot. So that, can be very expensive. And productivity, I mentioned, there'd been a loss of, a lack of, in terms of how proactive typically I have been throughout my life in terms of wanting to keep busy and wanting to be out, networking and um just working. There's been a significant impact on my activities in that respect, which has a knock-on effect in terms of money coming through the door. So, I am trusting and believing that at some point this will all balance itself out. Being forced into these positions there is it's wrong, it's unjust, and I'm not just talking about me, myself, anybody that's been experiencing this, and certainly those people who this is what they've been on the receiving end of, who haven't necessarily figured out what's causing all of the grief and the suffering and the struggle and the difficulties in their lives. My heart breaks for those people because they could quite possibly be looking at the circumstances and conditions of their lives, thinking, how did I get here? What have I done? Where did it all go wrong? And to know that other people have invested time, energy, expenditure into causing that for those people, it's evil. It is evil. And, if I can shed more light on it and hopefully somehow, some way reach those people who potentially maybe suffering with some of these things but not even know that that's what's happening, if any of this testimony can help them to identify, hang on, wait a minute, yeah, this started when that and this, and I've been experiencing that, if it can help anyone in any kind of way, it would be worth, what I've experienced and putting this together. All right, so I will do some follow-on sessions connected to this subject, but more from the point of view of the magic overview, is in just breaking it all down in like what the various approaches are and different tools and techniques and the different types of effects that can be created. So there's just more clarity around that. History, again, I didn't think it'd be something I'd find interesting, but as I've been digging into a lot of this stuff, the socio-political and legal history in terms of particularly what Shane Sador talked about in his blog about when the Draco, decided they were going to be calling it a day and leaving the planet, and the timeline in that respect in terms of when the humans who were, working in cahoots, who were the I think a lot of people call them the slave masters, or those who have been looking to inherit control of the earth. When they decided they didn't want to do like a disclosure thing and they just wanted to take over where the Draco were leaving off, timing wise, according to the chain of events that Shane lays out, I find it fascinating how synchronistic that then translated into being, the Age of Enlightenment, the sort of shutdown of magic and all of that. I'll detail it in a much more, you know, coherent way. I'm tired at this point and, I've been talking at you for long enough, but you'll see it's kind of fascinating, making a little bit more sense of the last 400 years or so on the planet. Testimonies, a lot of the practitioners or ex-practitioners that I've listened to, there's been some really interesting claims, let's say, that they've made of things they've been able to accomplish using magic, and certain insights as to what is, very powerful in protecting people from a lot of these practices. So I'd like to do a session that it's sort of more of a highlights in terms of, this is interesting, but this is really significant in terms of how we, keep ourselves well and out of harm's way when it comes to a lot of this stuff. So there's some more sessions I'm going to do, and then the playlists, I have now made them unlisted, and in the part 1 description I've already linked them if anybody wants to go and have a look at those playlists and just see if there's anything that catches your eye, if you want any more information. I will put those playlists in the description for this video as well. Oh, all right, so thanks for listening. That's the end of part 2. Wishing you nothing but love and positive vibes. And yes, I know it's cheesy, but I do mean it. So, good night, everyone.